What's up guys, it's Pliskin here, and before on this channel we've discussed how in Metal Gear Solid 5 they made the conscious decision of not using any real guns. Instead they opted to use fictional guns that are representative of basic ideas behind different types of guns. Originally I wanted to make a video breaking down every single gun in the Phantom Pain and talking about what its real life or inspired counterpart is. However, I realized that would make for a huge fucking video. So instead, today I'm Pliskin, and we're going to go through the 4 basic rifle types in the Phantom Pain and talk about what those fictional guns are based off of in reality. Now first off, we have the default MRS-4 rifle. Now this is the one used by Venom Snake, the Diamond Dogs, and some of your enemies in the open world. Now I've talked a lot about this fictional gun here. So let's just do a brief walkthrough of the history of the MRS-4 and then talk about why I think it's based off of what I think it's based off of. So if we go back to ground zeros, you can see that the MRS-4 in a long barrel configuration is the default weapon for the enemy guards as you go around the base. Snake uses his usual carbine version of this fictional gun. Now if we look at the long barreled version, the full-size rifle one would say, it's very reminiscent of the FAL. In fact, it's almost a carbon copy of the FAL, with the left-sided charging handle, the magazine paddle release, and the overall aesthetics of the weapon all harken to FN's iconic design. Now, the only major difference between this gun and the FAL is, well, there's 2. The first being that the charging handle reciprocates. On the FAL, that doesn't happen. But the second and most, let's say, relevant for this video would be the fact that it's taking a 5.56 Stanag magazine. Now the FAL never took 5.56. In fact, FN tried to make a version of the FAL in which, you could load 5.56 into it, and it failed horribly. The gun just isn't designed to fire that round. It's designed as a battle rifle, first and foremost. So while the FN Cal failed, FN still wanted to bank on this idea of making a carbine in 5.56. So they ended up making the FNC, where they took the basic idea behind the FAL and they reworked it, used a little bit more of the AK design to put together a pretty decent, I would say, 5.56 carbine. And that's what brings us back to the MRS-4. Now, while it still retains the ergonomics of the FAL with the left-sided charging handle and the magazine paddle release, something the FNC does not have, when it comes to overall aesthetics and application, this is what I feel the MRS-4 is mostly based off of. So even though one could say in function this thing works more like a Galil Ace, I feel like the FNC is a lot more appropriate here because of the MRS-4's FAL lineage, and because they didn't really have a Galil Ace in the 80s, and because it still functions mostly like an FNC, and really looks like an FNC. I do want to make a quick note that unlike the real FNC, whenever you mount any optics onto the MRS-4, it uses an M16 style carrying handle. Why they did this in the game was probably because around the 80s you still weren't seeing a lot of Picatinny rails. Picatinny rails being like what you see on the edges, that jagged looking stuff on more modern weapons that allows you to attach optics. Back in the day they just slap optics on top of whatever carrying handle the weapon had on it. And in this case they took their inspiration from the M16's obnoxious carrying handle / iron sights weird thing. The MRS-4 is basically a mesh of the FAL, the FNC, and then has some aesthetic design choices taken from the M16. Alright, next rifle we're going to talk about is the SVG. Now the SVG is very clearly, even to someone that doesn't know a lot about guns, based off of the AK-74. Now there are parts of this that are taken from Norinco designs, which are like Chinese AKs, but ultimately it holds the basic silhouette and ergonomics of the AK platform. The only unrealistic aspect of this AK portrayal, besides the mix and matched parts, would be the fact that when the Soviets upgrade their rifles, they switch back to the AK-47s. Now here's the issue with that. The AK-74 was the standard issue rifle of the Soviet military ever since 1974. In fact, they still use a variant of it to this day. However, I guess the game is going by, the game does go by the logic of bigger bullet equals more damage equals better. So since the AK-47 fired 7.62 by 39, whereas the AK-74 fires 5.45, I guess the logic was the AK-47 must be better, which is not the case. One of the reasons that they replaced the AK-47 was because the 7.62x39 was an outdated round. Yes, it's big, yeah, it'll hit with a punch, but the 5.45 round coming out of the AK-74 is a lot more practical, more likely to pierce body armor, has more of a wounding effect, and you have a lot less recoil. Still, I'm honestly just nitpicking here. I'd say the AK in this game is probably the most realistic rifle here. Like, they're all fictional, including the AK, with again those Norinco parts being added in there. If we wanted to get extra picky, we'd say that in Soviet era Afghanistan, normal Soviet troops would be using the AK-74, Soviet snipers would be using the SVDs, and then for those elite squads that you encounter here and there, they'd probably be using the AK-74 SU, which is a compact special ops version of the AK-74. Next up, we have the game's rendition of a battle rifle. Now, this seems to be like a combination of two different iconic weapons. In terms of its ergonomics, it reminds me of the SIG 550. The paddle release magazine, the right-sided reciprocating charging handle and the way it kind of sticks up, the sights, but then also in aesthetics it reminds me of the G3 with the green design, the way the battle rifle just looks and feels. However, it doesn't stop there. While that sums up the default version, when you go into Africa, you'll notice that the enemies are using this gun, however, they're not using it in its basic configuration. They use it in a way that looks more like the FAL, mixed with the SIG 550, where it still has the SIG's ergonomics, however, the wooden appendages that you see there with like the stock and the grip, the way they're styled, is very FAL. So this battle rifle is really just an amalgamation of the two most popular battle rifles at the time, the G3 and FAL, with the ergonomics of the SIG 550 thrown in there. So it's kind of tricky as different variations of this gun end up becoming different guns, if that makes sense. Default, it looks like a G3 with SIG DNA, but then when you see it in the battlefield, it looks like an FAL with SIG DNA. Lastly, this brings us to the Bullpup rifle, the G44. Now, while there is some DNA from other obscure Bullpups, this is pretty flat out easy to identify. Given the franchise's history with the FAMAS and the way that Metal Gear Solid 5 paid many homages to the first Metal Gear Solid game, it's not surprising that with the right parts mixing and matching, you can take even this fictionally designed weapon and turn it into a pretty much one-to-one recreation of the FAMAS. The other guns that it kind of reminds me of, like when it's in its long, awkward configuration, it reminds me of the L85. It also reminds me some elements like the charging handle of the VHK, I believe it's called. It's a Croatian bullpup, but ultimately this is pretty stand-up a FAMAS. It carries some functional aspects of the AUG with the whole old-school built-in sight and 9mm capabilities, but when it comes to raw aesthetics and overall ergonomic function, again, it's pretty much like an F1 FAMAS we're looking at here. So to answer the title of this video, what guns should really be in Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain? Well, the FNC, the FAL and Ground Zeroes, the AK, 47 and 74, the FAL and the G3 in Metal Gear Solid 5, depending on where you are. If you're in Africa, it's the FAL. If you're just using the default version of this battle rifle gun, leans more to G3. And then of course the FAMAS. It could be argued that it takes other traits of other bullpup rifles, but ultimately the aesthetic and the series history with the FAMAS lead me to believe that that is what this is paying homage to. But anyways guys, what do you think? Am I fixating too much on fictional weapons? Has this bothered you too and you've wondered, like, why didn't they just use real guns? Have you ever wondered what these guns were inspired by? Did you learn something in this video? If you did, like, subscribe, and if you have anything else to add to the conversation, if you think I missed a feature from one of these guns and they really should be more representative of something else, let me know. Anyways, this has been Pliskin. Hope you guys are having fun out there with whatever it is you're doing. Over and out.